Make it plain.
Make it plain.
M.I.P.
With Masamela Matfumo.
Mark Thompson.
Make it plain.
Get woke.
Ladies and gentlemen, as many of you know, one of my favorite organizations and efforts and campaigns is Color of Change. And many, many times we've had an opportunity to talk with our dear brother, Rashad Robinson. But there is also a great deal of black woman magic taking place, especially of late at Color of Change. And that's a good thing, because we need our black queens in the forefront of just about everything we need to get done right now. Two of the leaders of Color of Change are here with us right now. The brand new chair of the board is Heather McGhee.
Yes.
Heather, good to see you. How are you?
I'm so glad to be here with you, Mark.
All right, it's a pleasure to see you again. And Arisha Hatch is the vice president for campaigns, right? Did I have it right?
Yes, I am.
And you also are heading up the PAC, the Color of Change PAC as well, right?
Yes, Color Change Super PAC.
Color Change Super PAC.
Yeah.
All right.
4 years.
For 4 years. Well, the first thing we were talking about off mic, folks, is I don't know how many of you realize this. Color of Change came to be right after Katrina.
Mm-hmm.
It has been 15 years. I mean, that time has flown. I cannot believe it's been 15 years. And it's hard to believe because I'm only 30.
And I'm
Well,
25.
that's
so
what
I
I'm talking
don't
about.
know.
Right. We know what's up. Heather, you came to be known to many of us at Demos.
Yes.
And then when you left Demos, I was like, well, what's Heather going to do? She's too young to be retiring. I was like, did I miss some folk retiring younger than me?
Nonprofits don't pay like that.
Yeah, younger than me. But I'm glad you're at Color of Change. What inspired you to come in this direction?
So when I was running Demos, I was the president of Demos for 4 years, and I worked there for almost 16. And we were really a think tank for the movement. Using research and advocacy and lawsuits to address inequality, racial inequality, economic inequality, and political inequality. And so often we partnered with grassroots and netroots organizations to make sure that the power of ideas aligned with the power of people. And in that work, I got to know Color of Change. I got to know Rashad and Arisha and all the incredible staff there. And quite simply, there was no other organization that was as inspiring to me relentlessly on a daily basis because of the strategic choices that they were making, because Color of Change is able to take the presence of black people in society and move it strategically into power, and to understand how the stories that we're told shape our outcomes, to understand that there are often small elections like DA and prosecutor races where if black people shows up, it changes the course of our young people's lives. There was just no other organization that mostly online, the largest online racial justice organization that was doing it like Color of Change. So I'm still a fellow at Demos. I'm working on a book. I'm developing a couple podcasts. I still do NBC and MSNBC, but I wanted to really serve and volunteer. So just a couple of months ago, I became the chair of the board of Color of Change.
Yeah, outstanding. Congratulations. And we need you. Arisha, as Heather was alluding to, the operative word is political science, not political art. And we have found with Color of Change, I mean, everybody's on social media. Mm-hmm. Everybody's tweeting and hashtagging everything. But Color of Change is one of the only entities that has been able to translate that into scientifically measurable results, hasn't it?
I don't know if we're one of the only ones, but we definitely come to work each day thinking about what are the strategic things that we can give people to do in response to the injustice that they're seeing in the world. And so we have a whole bunch of campaigners whose purpose for this moment in life is to see what's happening in the news, to follow large issue areas like criminal justice or economic justice or voting rights, and to find opportunities where if we collectively come together and make a demand on a decision maker, that we can actually achieve the change that we want to see in the world. It feels sometimes like art. It feels sometimes like we're trying to imagine and create a world, that doesn't exist. But we've learned a lot of things along the way.
Yeah, yeah. One of the things I like to do too, Heather, when I'm talking to people and people will call me and say, we need to do something. We need some advice on how to organize this. And I'll say to people, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. Dr. King gave us 4 steps in a letter from Birmingham jail. Color of Change follows those steps. Step number 1 being collection of the evidence. And I mean, you go to Color Change, you get all the information about what's going on, negotiation, direct action. Direct action, Color of Change has really brought it into the next era where, of course, and I still support physical direct action, but now we have online direct action, don't we?
That's right. And one of the things that I love about Color of Change is the way we are focused on holding corporations and governments accountable. And so often people miss that corporations part. Like, take, for example, all the outrage that we all felt and have been feeling at the rise and the mainstreaming of white nationalism and white supremacy, right? Suddenly this is just something that someone could, pop open their laptop and become a member of, what is the latter day KKK. And it's just, it's just out there in the open. It's so accessible. It's so mainstream. And so what Color of Change did was they said, okay, let's look at the map of where these people are getting their resources from, these hate websites. And so often they're being funded by donations, and who's processing those donations? You know what? It's big companies, the credit card companies, the PayPals of the world that don't actually want to be associated with hate. So let's cut off the spigot. And that's what Color of Change did. They gathered our signatures in order to put pressure on the middleman, the bankers, the money processors, and they cut it off, right?
Yeah. We did a lot of work there. And yet the tide still rises. It's like one specific intervention point that we made around the rise in white supremacy. And yet we also understand that there's a whole bunch of culture change that has to happen in order to actually completely rid ourselves.
I like to say to people too, when we look at the online world, there's a lot of mischief too directed at our people. Color of Change challenged Facebook, didn't it? And, Color of Change, y'all are friends of mine. The organization is, I consider, part of my comradeship. So when Facebook was coming for Color of Change, I'm like, I'm done with Facebook.
Great.
But, that was an example of taking on what's happening on the internet and in the online world when it comes to targeting our people.
And what I love to see about that was that the executives of Facebook then felt like they needed Color of Change to say they were doing okay, right? They started blowing up Rashad's phone and, I'm the chair of the board, and so we would have these conversations, and Rashad would say, Cheryl keeps calling me, and, and we keep having to have these conversations about what they need to do on civil rights, on their diversity of their staff, on how they look at hate speech, on how they counter misinformation, on how they're suppressing the activism of Black Lives Matter on Facebook. All of these issues that we, the people, have with the big tech platforms like Facebook and Twitter and all of the other social media platforms, Color of Change is really holding that space, holding their feet to the fire. And right now, the tech companies feel like they need to answer to what Color of Change says is the standards.
Arisha, how does Color of Change determine the campaigns that it's going to initiate? And say, for example, there are people in the larger community, Black folk, there's an issue affecting someone in a community. Can they come to Color and Change and say, hey, we'd like you all to take leadership on this?
Absolutely. So we really organize ourselves into different issue areas, and we have a strategy within those different issue areas. So, for example, in criminal justice reform, we're trying to push back against those that are profiteering from police violence and mass incarceration. And once we get to that high-level theory of change, then there are several buckets of work that come from that. Where are the places where people are profiteering from mass incarceration and police violence? And so we started talking about bail. A predatory bail industry that continues to lock poor people up before they even get a trial. We come to prosecutors who 2,400 of whom are elected across the country and who have seemed over the last several decades to profiteer from this tough on crime rhetoric and tough on crime policy. And once we've sort of mapped out our strategy, we then, because we know these abuses are happening, when we see a story in the world that reflects those problems that we see, we are strategically thinking about what can our members do together to force our way into a conversation with the actual decision maker. And I think that's what we've gotten really good at. There's a ton of horrible things happening on Facebook. I'm a user of Facebook. Color of Change uses Facebook.
Right.
These platforms were built and messaged as places for good. But when things start to go wrong, what Color of Change has become really strong at is getting into a conversation with folks that can actually make the change, leveraging those members' petitions and comments and the activity that they're pushing on social media, and trying to speak truth to power once we're in those sorts of conversations. If a member or anybody sees some sort of racial injustice, particularly those that affect Black people out in the world, they can come and start their own petition on our platform, Organize For. They can, just like our original founders did after Hurricane Katrina hit in 2005, they can send that petition out to their friends and family, and they can begin to build their own organic movement before we then send it out to our broader email list. And we've seen lots of successes from folks who are having problems in their own daily lives, saying, you know what, this time I'm gonna speak up. I'm gonna say something. I'm gonna come to the Organize For platform and try to make a change.
What would you say have been some of the greatest victories you've witnessed Color of Change achieve since you've been there?
One of the first campaigns I worked on when I got to Color of Change in 2012 was pushing back against this right-wing organization called ALEC, American Legislative Exchange Council, which was pushing forth a lot of different model bills, one of which were discriminatory voter ID laws, which were spanning across the country, as well as stand your ground laws. And so I came on in February 1st of 2012, I'll never forget. It was just after my 30th birthday, and 2 weeks later, Trayvon Martin was killed. And his confessed murderer sat unarrested because of this law that none of us had ever heard of at the time. And it was because we were already engaged in a campaign around ALEC, around talking to corporations about voter ID laws that we thought were extremely problematic, that we were then able to quickly recognize that the same committee within this right-wing organization that was pushing voter ID laws were also pushing stand your ground laws. And it allowed us to go back to the corporations like Coca-Cola and Pepsi and Kraft, whom we'd already been engaged in a conversation about their support of ALEC, to say, now you really, really can't.
Yeah.
Now you really, really can't support this.
Yeah.
And so that was really my introduction to not only Color of Change, but to the corporate accountability work, the power of pushing back against corporations.
And we had almost 100 corporations leave ALEC,
Yes,
right?
yeah.
And they had to, give up their lease, and they've become much less powerful than they were then because of Color of Change's work.
And that's power too, being able to hold corporations accountable. It's a cliche now to even there's even one show, I won't name it, on MSNBC that has a commercial that says, "We speak truth to power," and I'm like, who are they talking about? but this is truth to power in a real sense, because you all in the room, again, led from Birmingham jail, negotiation. I like to remind people, we talk about presidential politics. When Kennedy and Johnson were president, they had to check with MLK before they made decisions and made moves, and that has disappeared, vanished somehow when it comes to the White House, even among some Democratic presidents. But to be in the room and to be able to say directly to people with the force and power of the sheer numbers Color of Change has behind it, right?
That's exactly right. And that's why, for example, in this presidential primary, Color of Change has started a new podcast, part of its Voting While Black platform. The podcast is called Voting While Black, and folks sit down mostly with Rashad Robinson, our president, and each of the presidential candidates has lined up to sit down and answer questions that come from our members, questions that come from our leadership. And so, people can find anywhere you can find podcasts, good substantive interviews entirely on Black issues with Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, people who have since dropped out but are still in our politics like Cory Booker and Kamala Harris. The only people who have not yet sat down for the Color of Change Voting While Black podcast are the latecomer, Mayor Bloomberg, and we're very much excited to see him have to answer to Black issues, and actually right now still the front runner among the Black vote, Joe Biden, who needs to get in that chair.
Has Deval Patrick come on yet?
Actually, Deval has not.
Yeah,
So
and our final Black candidate.
Yeah, and that's important because it's interesting. I mean, we know now. People finally have acknowledged you can't win the presidency without the Black vote.
I don't know that people have truly acknowledged that. I mean, to be honest, Mark, we've got people talking about Pete Buttigieg as more electable than other folks, and he has 0% of the Black vote. How are you going to get out of the Democratic primary past Iowa and New Hampshire? How are you going to energize the Black vote, which is required for anybody to beat a Republican, much less Donald Trump? I don't see it. But the fact that sentence, that Buttigieg is more electable, can even come out of people's mouths means they're not really thinking about how important Black people are.
And I think part of the problem, part of the miscalculation is that folks, including the Democratic Party, have felt like Black voters are just in the bag already because we are the most reliable voting bloc for Democrats and have been for years. Right. There is this expectation that they don't have to come into our communities, they don't have to talk about our issues. And we're seeing, I think, a generational shift in which millennials on down actually want to hear from folks. We're much more independent-minded. We're increasingly disenchanted with the power of politics to even shift our lives or to care about us. And so, I think we're reaching this sort of tipping point, and we started to see it the last election cycle, but I think we're reaching a tipping point in which the party and the candidates have to change how they think about their approach towards us.
Well, and it's not only that. I mean, we're talking about Black folk in general, but since 2016, people are just realizing the importance of the Black women's vote in particular.
That's right.
Aren't they?
That's
we
There's
saw what Black women did in
more.
2016, the difference that made. We saw what happened with Roy Moore down in Alabama. I mean, so that makes a difference too. And in fact, a lot of speculation is a Democratic nominee is going to have to put a Black woman on the ticket, period.
And really, if you think about it, this era that we are in, that started with the fact that this very qualified woman won 3 million more votes and did not walk into the White House. That era began there. There was a flashpoint moment with the Women's March, and then you had Me Too, and the Kavanaugh hearings where that white man sat up there and just yelled throughout his job interview and then got a job he can't be fired from. I mean, every person who's not a white man looked at that and thought, well, ain't that I mean, these insults, right? The attacks on our bodily autonomy that have been happening from, in state legislatures across the country and stacking the courts with people who want to take our reproductive freedom away. All of these insults have made this a moment of women's political power. Black, white, and everything in between, women's political power. We had 2018, the midterm elections, the record number of women running, record number of women winning. We now have the most diverse, in terms of race and gender, Congress in the history of the United States, and it's because of women's activism. I sit here as on the board of Color of Change. I also know organizations like Move On and Indivisible, all these Netroots organizations. Y'all, the secret is these are women's organizations. Yeah. If you look at who is doing the activism, who is showing up to, for example, in Color of Change, where you have these Black brunches that are all over the country where women are organizing and gathering and then taking their marching orders to organize their friends and family into politics and into activism. this is the era. This is our era.
Yeah. Some of the recent campaigns that Color Change has been involved in, I have home training, and I try to be polite. But, I'll say over the past probably 15 years or so, several times I've been invited to a wedding on a former plantation.
No.
And I don't want to.
You've been invited?
Yeah. And no, I mean, these are black folk, though. Black folks have weddings on these. Yeah, some black folks. I've been to black weddings at such and such plantation. And I don't want to tear up somebody's wedding.
No,
People
right.
already think I'm, wild militant anyway. So, just be cool, Mark. Don't say nothing. I have been to black weddings. As a matter of fact, there's one very prominent in Maryland that a lot of black folk have gone to. And I just said, so what? So I'm trying to be polite and nice and not say something. I just can't fight every battle. So I figured, I guess that's just what we're doing now. And when y'all came forward with that campaign, I was like, thank God. And so I didn't have to do it. I didn't have to do it myself. But I was like, thank God y'all have spoken up about these weddings on these plans. First of all, I mean, that shouldn't be happening to begin with. Yeah. And then here's another way for some place that enslaved our people to profit off of what we're doing. But that was successful, wasn't that?
Yeah, it was really successful. And I'll say it's strange how quickly things become normalized.
Yeah.
There's a white celebrity couple that has a wedding, and all of a sudden it's all over Pinterest or all over Instagram. And now everybody wants to have that aesthetic, to have that look. For their own Instagram pictures. And so we recognized there was a wonderful article that was written in The Nation. And we were like, yeah, this is deeply problematic. And as our campaigners were sitting around thinking, what can we do about this? The question was, we know we can't go to the plantations themselves because they're profiting. Who we can go to are folks like Pinterest, folks like Zola.com, folks like Martha Stewart's Wedding Magazine, Brides Magazine, and say, hey, do you recognize what you're doing? We know this is seems really normal right now, but if you actually take a step back, if Auschwitz decided to, buy ads in your magazine asking people to come have weddings at a
Holocaust site.
Yeah, at a concentration camp. You would be offended. You would be horrified. Yeah. And what we saw when we started reaching out to these companies, first with a letter before we started talking to our members about it, was that for some of them, once you actually pointed that out, they were like, oh yeah, you're right. That's really bad. Let us begin to think about the things that we can change. And so we had companies changing how you could search for a plantation wedding. They sort of disallowed those searches. They went through their advertisers list and said, oh, we're not going to take money from XYZ companies. They pulled down content that was glamorizing or glorifying these type of antebellum weddings. And it forced a conversation not only nationally, but also internally in a lot of these corporations about what was acceptable and unacceptable content for them to be promoting.
No, really. There's some black folk who've, and I know people don't have a lot of options when they want to have something nice for a wedding. But I've been to a couple of black weddings over the years. I'm like, well, why are we having this here?
And what kills me is the idea that you're not, listen, I think these are plantations. I think that we need to be going to plantations and talking about what happened to our ancestors in these places, right? I mean, there's a very different thing. It's making a memorial, talking about, reclaiming the land. But if you weren't doing a, land reclamation ceremony before you got to the raw bar, I don't think that was an appropriate plantation wedding.
No, not at all. Not at all. The Crown Act. Now, we had April Rain on the live show. She took over your social media, Color Change's social media, for Oscar So White. And in her own words earlier, Oscars are still so white. But Hair Love won an Oscar, and Brother Cherry mentioned the Crown Act. You all have been working on that as well, correct?
Yeah. The Crown Act, we think, is really important legislation. It's trying to, at the state level, ban hair discrimination in the workplace, which we know affects so many Black people across the board. I remember when I was coming through law school, I was told, like, you cannot go to that law firm. You can't walk into that white law firm with these braids in your hair. And it's a conversation that I think lots of Black women are having on, like, how we show up in our presentable in our own body and our own skin. And so these award shows, especially the Oscars, haven't been about Black people for a while. There's not a lot in there for us, I think, personally. But it was beautiful to see this conversation at least playing out on public stage, because so many people, and I don't think all people are bad. I think a lot of people just don't think about it because it doesn't affect them. Are being impacted by this sort of biased worldview.
And we had that young man from Texas who was not allowed to walk in the graduation ceremony from his school because unless he cut his dreadlocks. Yeah. Now his name was DeAndre Arnold. It went viral, this injustice, and so Matthew Cherry and Karen Rupert Oliver, who were the producers and the director of Hair Love, which is a short animated film about a Black dad doing his daughter's hair, brought him to the Oscars.
That's my story. I mean, that movie speaks direct. I used to try to do my daughter's hair.
Mm-hmm. And
I said try.
There you go.
Had a couple good days, but for the most part, no.
I remember my father trying to do my hair. It's a beautiful short animated film. It's an Oscar-winning short animated film. It was, funded in large part by Kickstarters from the community. I've been watching them, on social media for years now, trying to get this movie made. You can watch it in its entirety online, which is great, for free. Yeah. And it's a real celebration of us.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And it's great. And Matthew Cherry shouted out the Crown Act from the stage.
Well, he sure did. And just so everyone's clear, Arisha, on the Crown Act, because again, it's about enlightening people. Part of the problem is there are people who look like us aren't in the room. Mm-hmm. Somebody's probably asking, well, why is it called the Crown Act? And they might be think we're talking about the Queen of England, but we aren't. Explain for the unenlightened, when we say crown, what are we talking about?
I mean, I think, well, maybe I could be totally wrong. I think we're talking about...
No, of course, you're right.
Our head.
Of course.
Yeah.
And it stands for create and a respectful and open world for natural hair.
That's right.
That is what the acronym is. And, people can go on the Color of Change website, start a petition, send it to their community, and get it to the state legislature to pass it. Because that's the type of thing that you won't know if somebody, behind closed doors is losing a job or a promotion because of the way they wear their natural hair. We're sitting here, people can't see, but, Arisha has braids, Mark and I have locks, that expression needs to be protected because it's a natural part of our culture. And you may not know if it's legal right now in your state for somebody to discriminate because of the way you look.
So, again, for those of you who watch MSNBC, our friend and colleague Joanne Reed, for the past, since the beginning of the year, has worn braids on the air because of the law that was changed in New York. And she wears them all the time now. There was a time when you could be discriminated against. You could lose your job or be kicked off of television for wearing your hair in that way. So that's so when we say crowns, folks, we're talking about, the hair on our head, the way our heads are portrayed and the way we present them. And also because we as African people all wear a crown that was denied. So this is very important work that Color of Change is doing. The Super PAC. So tell us about that and what that's up to.
Yeah, Color of Change Super PAC was started in 2016 because, this was, a little bit in the aftermath of the movement for Black Lives. And we were, at the time, if we can take ourselves back to 2016, being fed, weekly videos of police violence. And we were sending out petitions. We were doing our normal thing, and yet there were never any officers arrested. There were never any indictments. There were definitely never convictions that were happening. And, despite the fact that Black movement had become this sort of global conversation, despite the fact that we are incredibly present, folks that take into the streets in Ferguson and a number of other places for weeks trying to protest and launch a national conversation about what we've been experiencing in our communities, we didn't have the power to actually see the changes that we wanted to see. And we were throwing around ideas like who should we be focused on? Is it the governor? Is it and we kept coming back to the prosecutor. The prosecutor was the problem, not just in terms of police violence, but in terms of the way our communities were being policed, in terms of the numbers of people that were ending up in a system of incarceration that affected their families for generations. And there was some research that was coming out at the time from an organization called Women's Donors Network. And they actually said that there were 2,400 elected prosecutors across the country. More than 80% ran completely unopposed. More than 90% were white men.
Mm-hmm.
And we thought to ourselves, can we complicate that?
Yeah,
Can we?
right.
What would it mean if people had a choice for prosecutor? I didn't know I could vote for my prosecutor, and it was because there was never a choice to do that. And so we launched the PAC in an effort to try to intervene, to identify candidates who would begin to talk about criminal justice and criminal justice reform in ways that were more progressive, that would, no longer use tough on crime rhetoric, that would talk about community safety in an authentic way that actually resonated with Black people. Since we've elected dozens of prosecutors, many of whom are Black, into our communities, and they're making real changes. They're changing the way that bail is leveraged. They're making different decisions about whether to prosecute someone for marijuana possession, for example. They're being more transparent in terms of the data that they release about the work that the prosecutors in their offices are doing. And crime isn't going up. So we know that these, things can happen, but at the same time. And so we've been doing that sort of work ever since 2016. We also we have member leaders, volunteers who are knocking on doors, calling their friends and family, texting their friends and family,
donating to the PAC.
Donating
to do that.
That's right.
You can go online and donate your dollars to the Color of Change PAC to pool it and make sure that it gets leveraged in the fight for justice.
Yeah,
Well, and that's important because that's a new thing. We historically, as a Black electorate in the Democratic Party exclusively, have not leveraged a lot of our dollars financially. We leveraged our numbers and our moral authority. But now that we got Black PACs, y'all, that changes the whole landscape, doesn't it?
That's right. Because that means that candidates come to us and say, what do we need to do to have your support?
That's right. That's right.
And particularly it matters with a progressive candidate that is not being backed by, private prisons, that is not being backed by big corporations and wealthy people who, have their own political ambitions. You actually need to put your money where your mouth is in supporting them. You do actually really need politics takes money until we completely change the laws that it doesn't take money so working class people can run and win. We have to play the game and we need to support our
Cummings once said to me years ago when he first got to Congress, he said, Mark, the problem is that many of us in the Congressional Black Caucus have a constituency that votes for us to represent them. But the majority of our funding doesn't come from within that very same community.
That's exactly right.
And that has been a historical problem. That's why you've had some Black Caucus members kind of go astray, and then others struggle to stay central and dedicated to that community that elected them. So this is big.
This is big. And this is also why campaign finance reform is a racial justice issue. Yeah. Because if you do things like what we have in New York, right, New York City, where you have matching public dollars to fund people running for office, for city council and for mayor and for public advocate. And, our governor keeps trying to throw a wrench in it, but we are on our path to getting that statewide in New York State. Then you can have someone who is, a school teacher or someone who is a nurse saying, you know what, I can run to elect my community because public dollars are going to fund the race, and it's not going to be me reliant on rich people and corporations. Yeah. So that's how you have to change the system. And until that system is changed across the country, you need to put, we need to support because, white people will support the candidates that they want. And
Put the
it's time
money
for us to do the
where
same
the mouth
thing.
is. Arisha, and the examples you gave in terms of people in positions that we don't think. See, sometimes people think the only thing to vote for is president. And when we start talking about prosecutors and whatnot, that's very important too. But I think there's even a lesson in this because, what happened on social media in the past 8 months, there was a whole campaign, a black woman prosecutor. And it was existential. Folk were saying, well, she's a prosecutor. Any black person who's a prosecutor is automatically no good. And the rest of us said, wait. What is that about? I mean, we struggled to be in all of these positions so that we can make a difference. And see, folks, that's the point I'm making. Color change, which is true and genuine to our people in our community, versus just anybody can put anything they want to on social media.
Right.
But that does not mean it is legit and is representative. Deep Dive, Stop Online Violence Against Women discovered a lot of those accounts singing that song weren't even real black accounts. So what you said, this is from an organization, folks, Color of Change, that has been in this game for a long time, saying we have to be engaged. We can't complain about criminal justice, what's going on in law enforcement, if we aren't engaged in putting people who look like us in. There's always going to be police and prosecutors. So why shouldn't there be black women and black men, police and prosecutors who can be there to make decisions on our behalf? And that's what this is all about.
Yeah, well, it's about that, and it's not looking like us is great. It also has to be a set of shared values that are really important. And so we've now seen prosecutors' races in Philadelphia where the black candidate wasn't the best candidate in terms of the policies we wanted to see. They were toting the old line, and sometimes it's unfair because as the black person, it's hard to be the person that's changing the status quo. Sometimes you just sort of say the company line. But, I think it's both diversity, but it's more than that. It's electing people that actually share our values and that can be held accountable to our communities. That is incredibly important. And look, I'm from California and am a big fan of Kamala Harris in a lot of different ways. The fact that they think it's incredibly unfair that, there's another prosecutor on the stage, a former prosecutor on the stage, but for some reason folks really focused in on her record. But I think that is also part of that is a result of the fact that there is now a conversation about how prosecutors can be different, how we can expect more from them. But it was a movement moment to be having that conversation, I think, in a national setting. Like she got a question on the debate stage, and we were like, wow, this is strange that this is happening now.
Because Amy Klobuchar also was a prosecutor.
Well, and Bernie and Biden voted for the crime bill, and Bloomberg is stopping frisk. So I'm watching. We're not going to take a sister out and then everybody. We don't even going to bring that. You took out Hillary, who didn't even vote for the crime bill. I heard of super predator in 2008. That didn't come up in 2008 at all. Then it comes up 8 years later. I'm like, wait a minute, we didn't even know. Most black folk didn't know there was super predator. So I mean, it's a woman thing too. Women are being held at to a higher standard, particularly a black woman. But again, and Kamala and I talked about that, and this is the campaign you all want. You want people in those positions that are progressive and uphold those values, and not just blanketly say that anybody who's a prosecutor or a cop is no good, because those people still in our community making decisions. We need to educate people to go in there and bring about change. Speaking of California, though, fair play. Color change played a big role in that, too. March Madness is coming up, which, by the way, folks, makes more money than the Super Bowl, World Series, NBA Finals.
Wow.
I mean, seriously. I mean, March Madness, all that.
Prince money. Wow.
Right. I mean, so not a dime of that. And we've been saying for years that is another form of exploitation of primarily African-American athletes.
Yeah. And so the Fair Pay to Play Act, which was passed in California and will go in effect in a couple of years, is actually going to force California schools to pay amateur athletes. And we think it's incredibly exciting, given, how much athletes from our families are helping others to profit. We think it's incredibly, potentially has the ability to shift the landscape in how we think about amateur sports. And California is going to be the first state that moves forward with this. It'll be interesting to see how it plays out. But if I'm an athlete and I'm choosing between a school in Louisiana or UCLA or US, and one of those states has, this act in place, we think it makes California much more competitive, and we'd like to see other states also follow their lead.
Again, another great initiative by Color of Change. Madam Chair?
Yes.
In your tenure, what would you like to see Color of Change do that it hasn't done already? What is Color of Change 2.0, if you will, going to look like by the time your tenure's chair is over?
That is such a great question, Mark. Thank you for asking it. So Arisha's been with the organization for 8 years. Next year will be Rashad Robinson's 10-year anniversary of being the president of Color of Change. When he joined, it was, a few hundred people on an email list. It was about $1 million organization. Now it'll be about 20, not including, the PAC work, which is separate. That's an incredible amount of growth. And the fact that you have CEOs of the most powerful companies, trying to get Rashad's cell phone number to sit down because they're going to have a Rashad Robinson problem if they don't do right, is a real testament to his leadership and the impact that Color Change has right now. We need to be political forces. Yeah. I think campaigning in terms of holding corporate actors accountable better than Color of Change does, not in the social justice space.
Amen.
But there is so much room for us to grow in terms of politics. The fact that presidential candidates, most of them felt they need to come and talk about our issues on our podcast, Voting While Black, that's great. Next time around, across the country, we need to be having Color of Change funneling the energy, the activism, and the dollars of Black people into making make or break political power for Black people in state legislatures, in city councils, governorships, as well as the DA races. Color of Change often talks about moving from presence. Black people are here, we're visible, we're in fact in some ways overrepresented in terms of our impact on the culture, right? You all saw that Google ad that was like the most searched, and it was like 25 things, athletes, speech, all these things, and it was all Black people. Great, we're here, but do we have the power to change the rules so that our families can thrive?
Yeah.
That is the question. And those decisions and those rules are being written in the halls of power, so we need to be powerful politically.
Same question for you, Arisha Hatch. You've been at this for a minute. How would you kick this up a notch?
For the majority of time that I've been at Color of Change, we've thought of ourselves as an online racial justice organization. And we thought our members, they just wanted to sign petitions or share things on social media. And so we didn't invite them to a lot of things in the real world. And now, because of some of the work that the PAC started doing in 2016, we are seeing that our members actually want to build offline community, and they actually want to build offline local power.
Wow.
And so when I imagine Color of Change in the next 10 years, I imagine us having real folks in states and places who are building power with their local prosecutor, with their local mayor, with the local school board, their people. They will be known as a force locally to reckon with. And they will be focused, and what they're focused on now, but it'll be an expansion. They'll be focused on empowering Black joy in their communities. and so that's not just about showing up to vote or being counted in the census. It's but it's about trying to realize this vision of Black joy for their families and friends.
Good point.
And so that's where I imagine Color of Change will be a household brand, and the work that we do will be a household brand, and that will allow us to push for more significant change.
Well, and I like what you said too. I mean, this is 365 days a year. If we're really going to be in struggle, if we're going to carry out eternal vigilance. It's not just the census. Everybody, census and voting, we get that.
Census huge.
But
Super
2021
important.
is going to be 2021, 2020. So there's state legislative races that affect that census and redistricting. There's continuing online voter suppression. The work that you all are doing is very important. And as I said, I prioritize and laud more than anything else scientifically measurable difference making. And that's what Color of Change is doing. Folks, we invite you to go to colorofchange.org, get involved, sign a petition, listen out to how you can do offline organizing as well. I think that's great. Congratulations to you both.
Thank you.
I think everything's going to be all right with the two of y'all.
Thank you, Mark.
Heather McGhee, chair of the board. Arisha Hatch, she was the vice president of campaigns and head of the Super PAC as well. Folks, we invite you once again to go to Color of Change. They're a legitimate organization online doing work. As I've said 1,000 times, everything that you are seeing, scrutinize it. We have to reopen our third eyes and know that which is real, from that which isn't real and is being targeted at us. It's important to note the group that is most targeted for disinformation is us.
That's right.
And there's a reason for that.
That's why you heard
So-
super predator.
Right. So somebody knows our enemies know our power greater than we know it ourselves.
That's
If
right.
we're the ones being targeted and don't even realize it. So there's something our enemy knows about our power that we need to learn. Color of Change is trying to teach us that. Thank you both, Heather and Arisha, for being here.
Thank you, Mark.
All right. Take care now. Thank you for listening to Make It Plain and Get Woke. Remember to listen, like, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and wherever you get your podcasts. Also, subscribe to Make It Plain and Get Woke daily. Check out makeitplain.com to subscribe. If all minds are clear, it has been made plain.